hear me? Yes. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this wonderful Passa Porta Festival. My name is Florence Noiville. I'm the foreign fiction editor of the literary supplement of Le Monde in Paris. And it's my great pleasure and great honor to welcome Russell Banks this morning. As you all know full well, Russell Banks is one of the greatest American writers. Born, let's start in a conventional way, in 1914 Massachusetts, where you grew up in what you call a relative poverty. And then you started writing in the 50s, if I'm right. Your work has been translated into more than 20 languages and has received numerous prizes and international awards. Your main works include the novels Continental Drift, Rule of the Bone, Cloud Splitter, The Sweet Hereafter, Affliction, The Darling. Some of these novels have been made into films, and we will definitely talk about films and cinema later on in the conversation. But your work also includes non-fiction, like Dreaming Up America, short stories, poetry, etc. So I should start in saying that for several decades you've been describing ordinary people, or people from small-town America, belonging to the margins or to the working class, or struggling with poverty, drug abuse, violence. And suddenly, in 2017, I remember interviewing you in Paris, you came up with a totally different book called Voyager, supposed to be a travel writing book, but in which you reflect on you, first of all, on your weddings, on your relationship with women, on your daughters. And I remember when I interviewed you, you said, I usually don't like to write about myself. So why is it that you suddenly felt the urge to write such a personal and intimate book? And are we readers discovering a brand new Russell Banks at almost 80 years old?
That's right. This is, thank you all for coming out this morning. I hope you all remembered to move your clocks. And so it's even earlier to your bodies than, in fact, it is on the clock. I'm very glad to be here. And I'm very glad to be with you again. It's a tough question you've begun with. I think the fact that I had reached my late 70s is what prompted me to write a book which is more of a memoir, really, than a travel book. And I figured I might as well do it now because I probably won't have a chance later. And most of my life is now behind me and not ahead. And so it was timely in that sense. And I wanted to understand an aspect of my life which was central to my life and was mysterious to me nonetheless. The first sentence in the book is, a man who has been married 4 times has a lot of explaining to do. And so it begins with that investigation into why that happened and how that happened. Because I honestly, at the beginning of writing the book, did not know. I'm not sure I know. I'm not sure I know now either. But no, I think so. I think that the keys to that mystery are in the book. Even though the book is ostensibly a book of travel to the Caribbean mostly, but also to West Africa and to mountain ranges in the Andes and the Himalaya and Kilimanjaro and so forth. So it's really an account of my voyages, and but underlying all of it is this investigation into love and marriage.
So could you give us even a little clue as to where that investigation led you?
Well,
For those of us who haven't read the book.
For those of you who haven't read the book, it's not a spoiler to tell you that that the fourth marriage, I've now been married 30 years, and so I know this is the last marriage as well. When my wife is asked, and which wife are you, she always says the last one. And I think that the important thing I learned was when I met and fell in love with the woman I've been married to for 30 years now, she was the first woman I ever fell in love with who didn't need me. And I think that may be the key to the mystery.
Come on, when you fall in love with someone, you always need him or her, don't you?
Right, and I fell in love consistently and continuously for many years until I was in my late 40s, really, with women who needed me more than I needed them.
And what is the link between this and your literature? Is there a link?
I think that in some ways the link is travel, really, and investigation of and an attempt to understand the other, people whose lives are different from mine or overlap with mine, my past in various ways. But it's, I think that's probably the connection between this book, the memoir, travel book, and the fiction. I mean, because so much of the fiction takes place in other parts of the world, in the Caribbean or in Africa or the southern United States, Florida, and so forth. So it's not surprising that there would be some linkage there.
Florida is where you spent half of your life with upstate New York. I think you divide your time, and then you travel a lot, as you just said. And from very early on, you wanted to escape America, to go first to Australia and then to Cuba. And once you said to me, I am an escapist, what does it mean exactly?
An escape artist, yes.
An escape artist.
Yes, and today I live on the borders. I mean, I live up near the Canadian border and in South Florida, near the edge of the Caribbean, so that maybe if Trump wins the next election, it'll be easy for me to get out of the country.
Didn't you already said that the previous time?
But that's true. I mean, I'm not. I think though, as I grew older, I mean, when initially, let me backtrack a little bit. Initially, when I lit out for the territory, as Huckleberry Finn does at the end of that great novel, I was running away from something, even though I ostensibly was running towards something. In the case when I was 18 years old, I was running toward Cuba, and I was hoping to join Fidel Castro in the Sierra Maestra Mountains and liberate the Cuban people. Although I was 18 years old and spoke no Spanish and hadn't a clue how to get to Cuba, I was nonetheless running away, even though I had that in my romantic, boyish goal, as a romantic, boyish goal. I was running away from my home life, from the dysfunctional family life, from the closure that I felt in that community. And at that time, the late 1950s was a time of great conformity and convention. And for a young, reckless boy like me, it was a restrictive environment. I was enthralled to Jack Kerouac's On the Road and other fantasies of escape and freedom. So I was an escape artist. But as I got older and more engaged in the larger world, and by the larger world, then I think the polarity of my travel reversed, so that instead of running away from something, I was running toward something I wanted to understand. For instance, going to the Caribbean in the 70s and going to West Africa in the 80s was an attempt to understand, actually, the history of the United States and the history of North America and South of the Americas, the history of slavery, from the other side, and its evolution and devolution, what ultimately its effect was on my own culture, my own homeland.
Is it true that at the very beginning you thought about becoming a painter, and then what eventually led you to literature?
Well, when I was very young, a schoolboy, I had a demonstrable talent in drawing and painting, and it was the only recognizable talent that I had. If you have a literary talent, literary imagination, it doesn't really reveal itself in childhood very well, or very impressively. In fact, what people usually do if you're a storyteller as a child is they tell you to shut up and stop lying, and so you're considered trouble and unreliable. But if you can draw, it's like you can play a musical instrument very quickly or something. It's a visible talent, and so I was praised for it, and continued to do it, and wanting more praise, as one does, began to imagine myself as an artist. And it wasn't until I was about 18, 19 years old, and I was on my own, and I was living in Miami, Florida, and I began to read for the first time without instruction and without a classroom. On my own, in a kind of omnivorous way, out of the public library.
Oh, I was going to ask, how did it happen?
Yeah,
the library?
No, it's just public library, and out of loneliness, boredom, and curiosity, I just started to read, and to fill my hours. And before I knew it, it was like a drug, and it had taken me in, and I was being led by it entirely. And then shortly after that, within a year or two, naturally I started trying to imitate what I was falling in love with, which was literature. And some of it was trash, and some of it was great works, because I was an autodidact, really. And the act of imitation really was what I think began my writing life. I fell in love with Walt Whitman's poetry, so I started writing poems with great long lines and ecstatic declarations and so forth. And then realized that this is a lot more difficult than I thought, and so I started writing stories like Hemingway with very short sentences and very exact physical descriptions and cryptic kinds of dialogue, and realized that too is more difficult than I thought. But I was learning as I was failing, and I think that's key for a writer, is to put yourself in a situation again and again where you fail, because that's the only way you're going to learn. You don't learn very much if you immediately succeed.
Right, and at some point you came across Nelson Algren, didn't you?
Nelson Algren, yes, because I was outside college and I wasn't going through the conventional patterns of growth for a young man who wants to become a writer. I was working as a plumber in New Hampshire, and Nelson Algren, the novelist, the great American novelist of the 50s and 60s.
Who was also Beauvoir's lover?
Yes, he's actually better known here probably as having been a lover of Beauvoir.
That's one aspect of him we do know.
For many years. In the United States, he's known as the first winner of the National Book Award, as the author of Walk on the Wild Side and A Man with the Golden Arm, the first man to write about drug addiction in a sympathetic way. And a great writer, pure and simply. Anyhow, I was as a plumber in New Hampshire, and I saw that he was teaching a workshop at something called the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. I had no idea, in Vermont, nearby, and I had no idea what that was, but I knew who he was, and I knew his work. So I went to this workshop, sent them a manuscript, and they gave me a little fellowship, and I drove up there in a pickup truck that I had. It's on the cover. That pickup truck is on the cover of the French edition of Voyager, yes. You'll see the number plate, 1962, so you know what year it was. And Nelson Algren was there, and he took me under his wing, really. He read my manuscript and then decided that I was worth his mentoring, and he did become a figure, a great friend and figure in my life, in my early life, and was instrumental, really. It was a kind of priestly laying on of the hands, you know, where I'll tell you just quickly how he read my manuscript, and I used this as a model many years later as a teacher. He'd leaf through, he had read the manuscript. It was a novel manuscript. It was terrible, and but he had read it, and he leafed through about 40 pages, and he'd say, "This is a really nice paragraph here." And then he'd leaf through another 40 or 50 pages, and he said, "Now here, this little stretch of dialogue is terrific. You really caught it there, right?" Then another 50 or 60 pages is, "I like this exposition here. You know, you've got the characters coming into a room, and then you don't really know why they're there, and so on." He said, "Now, if you write a whole book that's as good as those 3 pieces, then you'll have a good novel." And so I said, "Fine, that's great. That's all I wanted to hear." And then he did say, he said, "But don't worry, you have the talent. You have it." That's all I needed to hear. And that was my graduate education in writing. That was my MFA in writing.
And if you were 20 today, and would you also choose the novel? Would you choose the same path?
It's difficult to say. When I was beginning my writing life, the novel was, for an American certainly, and I think generally in Western Europe as well, it was the apex of the arts. It was the connector between the culture and the individual, and the primary connector, the one most relied upon, the one most trusted perhaps, one most instructive for us, how to live, how to think, how to act. That's no longer true. The novel doesn't have that role in the culture that it had in the whole first 3/4 of the 20th century and throughout the 19th as well. And so when I began writing, I wanted to participate in that relation to the culture, the broader culture. Today, but I don't know how powerful an impulse that was, looking back, that particular aspect of it. Because ultimately, and at bottom, I think I'm a storyteller, and that's more important to me than playing a pivotal role in the culture, and is enacting my life as a storyteller. And so I think today I might be more inclined and drawn to film, to cinema than to the novel. I'm not sure. You know, it's who can say? I unfortunately won't have the chance to start my life over and find out. But
no, but you do have the chance to start a new life, kind of, although it's not your first film, but you were just telling me before this conference that you were working with Bertrand Tavernier, the great French director, on a film. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, I met Bertrand Tavernier 2 years ago at Saint-Malo, and we became instant friends. We're both approximately the same age, and we're both eccentric and like to eat and drink wine and so on, and tell stories. He's a great storyteller, and a great filmmaker. I knew his work, and he liked my work. And so when we parted, I left him a book of short stories, Permanent Member of the Family in English. And he wrote me later, and he said, I fell in love with one of your stories, and I'd like to adapt it to film, but I want to make it an American film, and it's set in Miami, Florida, and I don't know anything about Miami. Would you co-write it with me? This is one of the great opportunities of my life, is to work with a great filmmaker and to co-write a script with him and learn how to do it his way. Because he began the conversation by saying, you know, I don't do it the way they do it in Hollywood. And I said, fine, that's good. And how do you do it?
How does he do it? How do you both do it?
Well, it was a little bit the way one writes a novel, in a sense that he said, I don't want to know where I'm going. I want to write a scene until I truly understand it, and then move to the next scene, which grows out of that scene. Not the way they do in Hollywood, and not the way they're taught in film school, which is the 3-act arc. The template is very rigid and fixed. The form and the beats of it are all very determined, predetermined, and so on. He wanted to invent it as he went along, which was fine by me. And in fact, it was very a great deal of. It's much more fun to work that way than to work with a rigid, controlling kind of format.
No, absolutely. Is it also the way you work when you write a novel? You invent it as it proceeds?
Right. I don't usually know where I'm going until I get there, and then I can look back and see where I've been. But it's not. I don't want to know, really. I want to keep it open until I get to the very end, narrowing my choices as I go. When you begin a novel or a short story, you have an infinite number of choices. You've written one sentence. Now what's the next sentence? Well, it could be any one of 1,000, 1,000,000 sentences are in front of you, an infinite number. And so you choose that, and then that cuts the possibilities of the third sentence in half. Now you only have half as many. And then you write a third sentence, and now you only have a quarter as many sentences available to you. You're narrowing your choices till you get down to the very end when you only have two. You go this way or that way. The hero lives or the hero dies. It's a wedding or a funeral. You don't know until you get to that point.
Right, so do we understand that the starting point is the first sentence, or is it the general idea? What is at the very root of the project?
Actually for me it has been usually a context. Something has led me into a world, a loose string or thread perhaps, that's lying there that attracts my eye or my mind. Or my ear, and then I just start pulling on it and seeing what's going to become unraveled as a result of that. So it's not, I can't predict or say what it is that begins, but I know, for instance, a novel that I'm writing now, and I hope to finish this year, begins with a man a white American man in a wheelchair in an apartment in Montreal, being pushed out of his bedroom by his Haitian nurse to be interviewed. I was just struck by the image of that. I just thought that would be really kind of interesting to think about and look at and say, what is he going to say to her? What's she going to say to him? And he's dying within about a paragraph or so. I had him dying of cancer, and I had him established as a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. I thought it'd be interesting for a filmmaker to be interviewed by a filmmaker and so on. So it just was pushing it that way. But it was that initial image of a white, older man dying in a wheelchair, being pushed by a very strong, big Haitian nurse. And they're speaking to each other in Quebecois French.
And then something develops between them.
Yes.
Yes. And then in the process of writing, how do you do? Do you erase a lot? Do you rewrite? Do you edit while you're writing? Do you throw away? Do you give up sometimes?
Really all of the above, I'm afraid, yes. But generally, more often than not, when it's going well, I write all the way through without extensive revisions and then go back and revise. Now I know what the book is about, I know what the story, I know the characters, I know what I'm trying to get to, and I can see it on the page, and then I can go back and begin to shape and point it toward what I can glimpse in the manuscript. But I don't revise or finish as I go. It's a very interesting difference between writer to writer. I know Michael Ondaatje very well and how he works. He won't write a sentence until he has perfected the previous sentence, which is, to me, a very strange way to work. And then there are other writers who won't write without a very carefully detailed outline. line by line and scene by scene and so forth, which I don't think I could work that way either.
And then there are others who need the title before they begin.
Right.
Is it your case? It's another way of asking you if you have the title of the new novel.
I do have a title of the new novel, but I don't know if I'm going to keep it. That's the problem with it, getting a title early, is that you get sort of married to it, as it were, and you're stuck with it, and and the novel becomes so identified with the name of the novel that you are unable to see it with any distance or hear it, and then you send it to your publisher, and the publisher comes back and said, "This is a terrible title," and then you have to rethink the whole thing. But the one I'm working on now is called "O Canada," O-H, comma, Canada, like the national anthem for Canada, except there's this O, Canada.
I hope they keep it. I hope they keep it.
You think it's all right?
More than all right.
Okay.
It's not for me to say, but we were also discussing another project of yours, very interesting one about opera.
Oh yes, not opera, not the television.
No,
opera,
no, a libretto, a libretto for l'opéra.
No, I wrote I'm writing a libretto for an opera for the first time. I've never done anything like this before. I happen to like opera very much, but I don't consider myself in any way an aficionado or knowledgeable particularly. But I wrote an essay, it was published in the New York Times, about an encounter between Mark Twain and Charles Ives, the great American composer. He's probably the greatest American composer of the 20th century, and Twain is probably the greatest American writer of the 19th century. And there was a night in America when the two were in the same room, and Mark Twain was interviewing Charles Ives to see if he were fit for the hand of a young woman who was his goddaughter. Young woman's name was Harmony Twitchell. My wife's name is Chase Twitchell, and she's a descendant. Yes, the great niece of Harmony Twitchell. So this is a Twitchell family story that I knew through my wife's family, and I just thought that's a remarkable evening in America when these two people, the old Twain and the young Ives, are together in this room. And so I wrote this essay about it. And then a composer named Robert Carl saw it, and he said, that would make a terrific opera. And I happen to really like his work. He's a wonderful composer. And so we sat down together, and I said, well, I'll try to write the libretto. And I then did, as I first started writing screenplays, went out and read a bunch of libretti and tried to figure out how to do it from that basis. And now we're workshopping it this summer at a music sort of post-graduate type music camp in the upstate New York, and they will perform it and put it on, and it should travel, and we'll see how it goes from there.
Are you also very much into music? Is it something that that inspires you? For instance, music when you write.
I do. Yes, I listen to music a lot. Mostly it's jazz that I listen to. However,
what kind? Who? Names?
Well, mainly it's what I guess they call classic American jazz in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. The jazz I grew up with, the jazz that I'm very nostalgic about in many ways, and I associate with my youth and the life of my first ventures into urban life, really, when I was young.
The political fights or civil rights and things like that.
Right, from that, I associate it all with that era. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So talking about politics, I don't know if you want to say a few words on
maybe about
Trumpism.
50 or 60,000 words, maybe we could talk about politics. How can we, it's very difficult not to talk about politics, at least today in the United States and here too. And ever since I've arrived, I've been talking about both American politics and Western European politics, because we're clearly going through a state of incredible crisis, historical crisis. And it's to me a very frightening period, especially as we watch what we have taken for granted for in the United States for several hundred years now, representative democracy and watching it devour itself. It's an auto-cannibalistic kind of period in some way, and it's terrifying to see it happen. I've been reading a book, well, I won't go into that. It's going to take us off in another direction. I'll just say that I've spoken to a number of people since I've been here this time, and they are shocked to hear me say that I think that Donald Trump has a very good chance of being reelected. And not because he will win the election, but because the Democrats will lose it. They're quite capable of losing this election, unfortunately. And if that occurs, I've got my citizenship papers in line for Canada. They're all ready to go.
Oh, Canada.
Oh, Canada. I'm going to maybe make a run for the border, and if it happens, I think, because I think that it's such an awful turn for the American people.
Is that, you said you were frightened, is that what frightens you most? The lack of invention and imagination of people on the other side who should be able to reinvent democracy or to come up with a new dream or any kind of model?
Well, sometimes you feel, or I feel that what's shocking and frightening is the cruelty of the right in America. Racial and class cruelty, and the manipulation of the fears of especially poor, undereducated white American males particularly, and the ends are cruel and selfish, short-term, greedy ends, and the means are of achieving those ends are inciting and exploiting the anxieties and fears of people who should be instead inspired and reassured and comforted.
Right. And you, as far as you are concerned, you've spent most of your writing life writing about those people, as I said at the beginning. So in the end, what do you make of, do you think, it's a hard thing to say, but do you think this writing all these novels can have had an impact on the way the American society looks at those people?
I can't say. You know, Doris Lessing, the great British novelist, said, things don't change at the center, they change at the edges. And then they move in slowly from the outside to the center, finally. And I saw that occur in the civil rights era when it didn't change at the White House with Lyndon Johnson or before that. It changed out on the streets of Birmingham, Alabama. It changed in the schoolhouses of the South and then eventually of the North as well. It changed in the streets and then gradually worked its way in to the center and then changed policy.
So you're finally fairly optimistic.
No, I'm not. But what I'm saying is or leading to saying is that if a novel can change anything, it only changes at one reader at a time at the edges. And I mean, I was changed by novels, and they changed my life, changed how I viewed other people, changed how I viewed myself. It humanized people that the culture wanted to dehumanize. And so I think that if fiction, art has any impact, that's how it has an impact on one individual at a time, and is silence in silence. And then gradually that individual will change the person on his left or her left and her right, and then that person will change and so on. It can move in that way if it occurs. But when you have the tide of resistance is so strong as it is today against that, both economically and culturally, politically as well, it's very difficult to even change that one person at the end.
I'm asking because recently I interviewed Toni Morrison, and she said, you were mentioning Birmingham, she said there was Birmingham in 1963, and now recently we've had Birmingham again, so you see everything changes but nothing changes.
Yeah, I know. That has been true.
And she seemed to be fairly
She's pessimistic
depressed.
also, yes. No, it's very hard not to be depressed at this point. But you know, then there are other ways to look at it. I have 4 daughters, and I know that their lives are different than their mothers were 40 years ago, 40, 50 years ago.
For the better.
For the better, yes, they are. And they all have, they just have a different life. It isn't an easy life, and it isn't a done deal, but it's different in a positive way. I have a black grandson, and he's 11 years old, and his life as a young black male, it's obviously a threatened one. It's one that makes him a target in many ways, but it's different and a little bit better than it would have been if he had been born when I was born, 1940. So yes, there is change. It's slow, it's gradual, and it demands we constantly come back to it again and again and again. It isn't that we solve the problem and then there's no problem. No, it doesn't work that way.
And we're now in Brussels, the heart of Europe. What do you make about the EU when you look at it? What's your view?
There is, of course, the folly of Brexit. We have that in front of us, and that kind of points to, I don't know what it points to, actually, and I'm much more interested and concerned about the parallels between the rise of authoritarianism and anti-immigration in Western Europe, the parallels between that and in the United States.
Even racism, we can...
And the racism and the rise of that, the resurgence of that, and the political exploitation of the anxieties of people with regard to race and class and economics and so on. That seems to me to be a much more dangerous thing than the folly of Brexit. I don't understand it any better than the British do, so there's nothing I can do and say about views about that.
Any clue about what could be done?
What can be done?
Yes.
Oh dear, sometimes, the forces of history are so dominant and powerful that all you can do is try to escape. I'm reading stories about German Jewish intellectuals in the 1920s and 30s, gradually realizing the forces that were arrayed against them and threatening them. And gradually giving up the fantasy that, well, if we just put up with this for another couple of years, it'll change at the next parliamentary election, or it'll change next time, and slowly coming to an awareness of how powerful history can be. It isn't always consistently that powerful, but there are moments in time, 1848 or 1933, or there are moments when you become overwhelmed by it, and there's an enormous shift. And I think we may be going through one of those periods now.
Is it more difficult to write in the era of in those times that you just described, with fake news and post-truth, etc.?
Well, I think you have to become. In some ways, you have to go underground. You have to be a saboteur of the media, and don't let it use you. It's very difficult today to not be used by the media for its own purposes, which are, in the case of the United States, and I think probably Western Europe. I mean, you work with Le Monde, so it's, I think, true of Le Monde as well, is that the bottom line is owed to the shareholders. And so the degree to which the media is controlled by its obligations to its shareholders is the degree to which it's not useful to its readers. And so the only way to avoid that from a writer's point of view is to try to find another way to communicate. And the internet does create a possibility. It's being sabotaged from the extreme radical right. It's also why not then sabotage it from the extreme radical left, or just the timid left? Why not that? But so maybe that's the best way now. I mean, my wife keeps encouraging me to start a blog. Why don't you write a blog instead of making me miserable and bored at the dinner table every night? I bet there are wives all over the world saying that to their husbands. Please start a blog.
And?
I think she's right. I think I can get a lot off my chest that way. And I also, however, might find a way to the eyes and ears of readers that without going through the New York Times or the Washington Post or the major media outlets.
So good for us. We might have a blog very soon. Okay, time is flying, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who would like to ask questions. Questions can be asked in English or French. Okay. Is there a microphone somewhere?
Mr. Russell Banks, could you tell me what's your favorite book from Russell's Bank?
Oh, my favorite book of my own is...
Yeah.
Well, let's see. I'm glad you didn't ask me who's my favorite daughter of the four.
Beautiful.
But it's a little like that, I know. And it's hard to say. You know, if you ask me about my daughters, I would probably answer my favorite daughter is the one that other people don't understand or appreciate. Mm-hmm. And I would probably say the same thing about my books. That my favorite of my books is one in particular that has had a sad publishing history. It was rejected by my publishers and rejected by magazines when I submitted sections from it, and nobody wanted to publish it, even though I had published quite a few books by then. It's a small book. It's called The Relation of My Imprisonment. And eventually it was published in a small press, by a small press in a nice, handsome edition, and eventually it was found. But nobody reads it, and it's like the daughter that everyone ignores and doesn't pay attention to and thinks the others are much prettier and smarter, and so that's my favorite.
Thank you. And the last one, what's your favorite author that inspires you for your work?
Well, there are so many. My favorite author, or most inspiring author, it's impossible to answer that question because and it changes too. I mean, there are different stages of life. You know, when I was young, my favorite authors were mostly the great 19th century American authors, and then the great 2 or 3 great 20th century American authors who were all male, who were all white. It took me a while to kind of realize that they weren't the only people who wrote books. But that was because I was young, and I was white, and I was male, and that was, you know, what was available to me, too. Most available to me. And you have to remember, when I was beginning writing, Hemingway was still alive, and Faulkner was still alive, and Fitzgerald had only recently died, and so the giants of 20th century American literature they weren't distant memories, they were real presences. But then later, in later years, this shifted and changed as I shifted and changed and grew. And so today, it would be difficult for me to say, but I know I will read everything that Toni Morrison writes, for instance. And I find myself increasing, and Don DeLillo, everything that he writes, I will read. And there are others I could put on that list as well. But I find now at this age, I'm trying to read books that I missed along the way and going back, and most of those writers are dead, so I'm reading the past.
No discovery within the young generation?
No, Tennessee Williams, when he was in his 60s, the great playwright, was asked, who among the young playwrights do you like, Mr. Williams? And he said, honey, I'm too old to cover the waterfront. And I sort of feel the same way, you know. It's time, they can have the stage. They're welcome to it. I don't need to read them now. If it takes me 3 to 5 years to write a novel, and I'll turn 80 this year. That doesn't give me much time to write, and so I better pay attention to finishing what I can.
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, retrospectively, would you say that you are happy to have spent most of your life writing as a writer?
Am I happy for that to have happened? Yes, I think it's better than having, for me, spent my life as a dentist, let's say, or as I began, and my father spent his life, and my grandfather spent his life as plumber. When I was about 22 and I was working as a plumber alongside my father, I was complaining about it and about being a plumber, working as a plumber. And it wasn't a class complaint. It was just I didn't like the work and I wasn't very good at it. And I told him that. I said, you know, I don't like plumbing. And he was then in his 50s, and he looked at me and he said, do you think I like it? It was one of those revelatory moments, you know. I said, I don't want to be 50 years old and have to answer that question that way. So yes, I'm glad that I was able to spend my life as a writer. It's been a privilege, and it's provided me with great, yes, some despair and at times loneliness and all the things that people romanticize about being a writer. But on the other hand, it's through writing I've been able to be more honest than I could be under any other circumstances, and more truthful. I can be more intelligent than I can be under any other circumstances, and I can be more open and curious about the larger world than I could have been under any other circumstances. I mean, most of the time I'm not very intelligent and I'm not very curious and I'm not very honest. So it's allowed me to be a better person than I might have been otherwise.
But what about the difficulties? What was the biggest difficulty you had to overcome?
Well, the biggest difficulty for most writers, I think, first is economic. Just how do you make a living from something that is not likely to provide you with a living? So whenever people say, what do you advise your young writers? First and foremost, I say, don't quit your day job, because you're going to need one. And so it's economic, and I think it impinges upon your relationships, and then maybe in particular your family relationships, because it is a consuming life. I mean, one that is obsessive and makes it difficult for you to remember that you have responsibilities to other people that involve time and energy and care and so on. And so I think that it's very easy for a writer, let me put it another way, it's very difficult for a writer to be a good spouse and a good parent, because you're on a mission, and you're on a mission from early on, and you have to stay on that mission for most of your life. You don't retire from it.
Yes.
You have the mic, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. I've been deeply moved by something you wrote in, I think it's in The Angel on the Roof. And you wrote that we all write for one reason. And the reason why we write stories and we tell stories is to be loved as we are, to be loved for who we are, without any condition. Would you still agree with that sentence now, today?
Yes, I still believe that. I might rephrase it today somewhat differently, depending on the context. That was within a collection of stories and an attempt to try to say why these stories existed in the first place. But I think that in some ways, writing at the highest level is a little like prayer. And most prayer is an attempt to be loved by a power greater than yourself, and protected, perhaps. But it's not just a wish. So it's a little like that. And I think that the task of a writer, really, the greatest and the most important and pervasive task in the work is to humanize and to give dignity and respect to the subjective interior experience of every individual, not the group, but the individual. And that is, in other words, to love the interior life of every individual, the secret subjective life of it, no matter what that person has done or how that person is perceived by the larger world.
That's a very beautiful and powerful image, writing as a prayer. Should we stop on this, or should we take another?
Shall we all pray?
Or shall we all pray?
This is a kind of an ecclesiastical circumstance here.
Let's pray, brothers. No, there's another question there.
Hello.
Hello.
It's an honor to meet you and hear you. I just want to know what has, for you, evolved, changed in your way of writing over the years, in the way you write, but as well the content and the way you think you're writing, what you want to achieve. And I guess this is something maybe you give to the students. And if you think it's part of what you did is a part of a gift, or it's really on or hard work?
Well, there's two questions really, aren't there? Yeah. The first is over the years, has my modus operandi changed really? And I think it probably has. I think I trust the process much more than I did when I was young. So I'm more willing and able to let go of the controls, of the conscious controls of the operation, of the process, and trust it, and trust my intuitions more than I did. In that sense, yes, it's changed. I mean, I'll leave it to the critics to decide whether the actual texts have altered and changed or improved or fallen off over the years. That's really not for me to say. But I know that in the act of writing, I'm a more trusting writer than I was. Doesn't mean I know what I'm doing, but I trust the process more. And the other question, would you repeat it for me? Oh yes, I remember. Yes, yeah. I think you have to have a certain amount, but a relatively and surprisingly small amount of talent to begin with. I taught writing at Princeton University for many years, and saw many incredibly gifted students come through there who were never be writers. And then a few others who came through who were not as talented, but who became writers, became today well-known writers even, wonderful writers. What you have to have is a willingness to endure rejection for a long time, and a willingness to not know what you're doing for a long time. And that's difficult to acquire, and that's about character in some ways, more than anything else. And you have to be willing to sacrifice, as I mentioned earlier, certain aspects of a normal social life, really, and normal economic life. You have to let that go, and those are all difficult to combine. Those particular strands.
One last question.
That's good timing.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
As you said that you were interested in film, I was wondering, were you involved in the making when they turned The Sweet Hereafter into a film, and were you happy with the result?
Yes, you're talking specifically about The Sweet Hereafter, de Beau Lendemain.
Because it's my
Yes.
favorite.
Well, that's directed by Adam Egoyan, the great Canadian filmmaker. I was incredibly lucky with him. I mean, first of all, he's a great filmmaker at his best, and he was at his best there, I think. And that's a very difficult book to adapt. I never thought it would be adapted. It has 4 different points of view, and it begins with a school bus accident in which a lot of children are killed, and so I mean, it's a hard way to start anything, and let alone a novel, let alone a film, and a shifting point of view, and so on. And I thought he did an elegant and beautiful job of it, and hewed very closely to the themes and the tone of the novel. And so I was very grateful to him for that. I was involved quite a bit due to his generosity, really. He sent me every draft of the script. We went over it and over it and over it. It is his script, but he consulted at every stage of the way, even up to the point where I was in the editing room at the end. And he even gave me a small role. If you watch carefully, you'll see me appear for my Alfred Hitchcock moment when I walk through it. Actually had a line, too. But I think it's a beautiful film, and I'm grateful to him for that. And we hope to work again together again someday, in some capacities with some project and all. Yes. Well, I wanted to thank you all for coming out this morning. You've been a very attentive and lovely audience. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And don't forget, Russell Banks will be signing his books at the entrance of the building. Thank you, everyone.